spotted my daughter through the window of a laundromat on a Tuesday afternoon, and I almost drove past without stopping. I'd just come from my dentist appointment on Ridgewood Avenue, and I was tired, my jaw still a little numb, and all I wanted was to get home and make myself a cup of tea. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the coat, that old gray wool coat she'd had since college, the one with the missing button on the left cuff. I'd offered to sew it back on at least a dozen times. She always said she'd bring it by. I pulled into the parking lot. She was sitting on one of those hard plastic chairs next to the dryers, hunched forward with her elbows on her knees, staring at a machine like it owed her something. Her hair was pulled back in a way that wasn't neat. It was the kind of pulled back that means you stopped caring, or you ran out of time, or both. There was a child's small sock on the seat next to her. Just one. I knocked on the glass. She looked up, and for just a second, half a second, really, something moved across her face that I hadn't seen since she was about 9 years old and had fallen off her bicycle and was trying to decide whether to cry. Then she smiled. A little too wide, a little too fast. I went inside. "Mom," she said, standing up, "what are you doing out this way?" "Dentist," I said. "What are you doing in a laundromat? You have a perfectly good washer and dryer at home." She looked away, picked up that little sock and folded it over her fingers. "It's broken," she said. "The dryer." Now, I want to tell you something. I raised that girl. I know every single version of her voice. I know the voice she uses when she's excited, and the voice she uses when she's lying to spare my feelings, and the voice she uses when she is absolutely terrified and trying her hardest not to show it. That last voice, that was the one she was using right then. "Audrey," I said. I kept my voice very calm. "Where's your car?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It's in the shop," she said. "How did you get here?" A pause. Just a half beat too long. "I got a ride." "From who?" She didn't answer. She just kept folding and unfolding that little sock, and I stood there in that laundromat that smelled like fabric softener and something sour underneath it, and I thought, something is very wrong. Something has been wrong for a while, and somehow I missed it. I sat down in the chair next to her. "Sit," I said. She sat. "Talk," I said. And slowly, the way you drain a wound, it came out. "My daughter Audrey is 34 years old. She has a daughter of her own, my granddaughter, Bea, who is 4, and she has been married for 3 years to a man named Curtis. I want to say, because I think it is important, that I never fully trusted Curtis, not from the beginning. He was charming in that particular way that sets off something quiet in the back of my mind. Very smooth, very quick with compliments. Always said the right thing at the right time. My late husband, God rest him, used to say that about certain men he'd met in business. The ones who are always exactly right. Watch them. But Audrey loved him, and she was happy. Or she seemed happy. And I told myself I was being an overprotective mother. I told myself I needed to mind my own business. I made myself believe what I wanted to believe. 3 years ago, when Curtis and Audrey got married, she had a decent apartment in her name. A 2-bedroom on the east side of Millhaven that she'd been renting for 2 years and keeping beautifully. She had a job she liked, processing insurance claims at a firm downtown. She had a car that she'd paid off, a white Honda CR-V that she was proud of. She had a savings account with a little over $8,000 in it. She was not rich, but she was independent, and she was stable, and she was mine, and that was everything to me. Within 6 months of the wedding, Curtis had convinced her to move into his mother's house. His mother, a woman named Faye, who I met exactly 4 times, and each of those 4 times she looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to decide whether to throw away. She had this habit of referring to Audrey as the girl. Not your wife or Audrey, just the girl. As in, can the girl make it by 7? And tell the girl we need her to bring something. I said something about it to Audrey once. She said I was reading too much into it. The reason, Audrey told me that day in the laundromat. Her voice flat, like she was reading from a list she'd memorized. The reason for moving into Faye's house was that they were saving money to buy their own place. It made sense on paper. I can see that, but what actually happened was different. What actually happened was that Curtis and Faye decided quietly and between themselves that Audrey's paycheck should go directly into an account they controlled. For the house fund, Curtis told her. It just makes more sense to pool everything. She was 27 when they got married. She loved him. She did it. He told her the account was joint. It was not joint. She never had login access. He always had a reason whenever she asked about the balance. The bank's doing some maintenance. I'm dealing with it. Don't worry about it. You don't need to stress about that stuff. I've got it. Then her car. About a year and a half into the marriage, Curtis told her his truck needed major repairs and he needed to borrow the CRV for a few weeks. She said okay. A few weeks stretched into a month. She started taking the bus to work. When she asked about her car, he said the repairs on his truck were taking longer than expected and he needed it a little longer. She said okay again. She said okay a lot, I was learning. After 3 months, she found out, not from him, but from a coworker who'd seen it, that the CRV was being driven regularly by Faye. Not Curtis, Faye. Running errands, picking up dry cleaning, driving an hour to visit her sister on weekends. When Audrey confronted Curtis about it, he told her she was being selfish. He told her his mother had done so much for them. The least they could do was let her use the car. He said if Audrey had a problem with it, she needed to think long and hard about her priorities and about what kind of family she wanted to be part of. Then he didn't speak to her for 4 days. She stopped asking about the car. She had been walking to the bus stop every morning for 11 months by the time I found her in that laundromat. 11 months. In all weather. Sometimes with Bea, on the days Faye didn't want to watch her. She had a transit card she loaded with whatever small amount of cash Curtis gave her each week for personal expenses. Not a paycheck. An allowance from her own earnings. I listened to all of this without speaking. I have never in my life wanted so badly to put my car in drive and go somewhere and do something I would regret. But I sat very still with my hands folded in my lap, and I listened, and I let her finish. Then I asked, does he know where Bea is right now? She's with him, at the house. Does he ever threaten? I stopped, chose my words carefully. Has he ever said anything about Bea, if you tried to leave? The way Audrey's face changed told me everything before she said a single word. He says she's living in a stable home, she said. He says if I try to make trouble, he'll tell a court that I'm unstable, that I have a history of anxiety. She paused. I did have a hard time for a while after Dad died. I saw a therapist for about 8 months. Curtis knows that. He brings it up sometimes. I want you to understand what I felt in that moment. It wasn't just anger. Anger is hot and quick, and I know how to manage anger. What I felt was something much colder and much more deliberate. It was the feeling of understanding exactly what you're dealing with and exactly what you need to do about it. Are you ready to come home? I said. She started to cry, not dramatically, just quietly, the way exhausted people cry when someone finally says the right thing after a very long time. I'm scared, she said. I know, I said. That's okay. You don't have to be brave right now. I'll be brave right now. That's what I'm here for. What I did not tell my daughter in that laundromat, because I did not want to worry her more than she already was, and because I needed her calm and I needed her to trust me, was that I had already started turning over options in my mind before we'd been sitting there 5 minutes. I have been around long enough, and I have seen enough in this life to know that when a man is using a child as a threat, you do not move slowly. You do not wait and hope. You build your case quietly and carefully, and you move when you are ready, not before. The first thing I did when I got home that evening was call my friend Marlene. Marlene retired 3 years ago after 26 years as a paralegal in family law. She is not an attorney. She was very clear about that, but she knows things and she knows people. And she is the kind of woman who, when you call her at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday and say, I need help, does not ask unnecessary questions. She just says, "Okay, tell me." I told her everything Audrey had told me. Marlene was quiet for a moment. Then she said she needs a family law attorney before she does anything else, not a general practice attorney, someone who handles this specifically. She gave me two names. I wrote them both down. The next morning, I called both numbers. The second one, a woman named Patricia. Wait, I need to check myself. A woman whose name I will not share for privacy reasons, but who came highly recommended, could see me that week. I made the appointment for Thursday and I told Audrey I would come get her during her lunch break and take her myself. Curtis did not know about this meeting. Audrey told him she was having lunch with a coworker. He checked her phone periodically. She had learned, over time, how to delete certain conversations before she got home. That fact alone, that my daughter had had to learn how to hide things from her own husband in order to survive, made something crystallize in me that has not softened since. The attorney was direct and clear. She said that Audrey's situation, while deeply unfair and in several ways potentially criminal, needed to be handled strategically. She said that the anxiety history Curtis was threatening to use was unlikely to be as powerful as he believed, particularly against a documented pattern of financial control, and particularly given that Audrey was the child's primary caregiver. She said we needed to document everything, every penny, every restriction, every incident. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. The goal is not to punish him even though he deserves it. The goal is to get your daughter and granddaughter out safely. Once they're out, justice has options. But you can't get to justice if you escalate too early and he digs in. I understood that. I did not fully like it, but I understood it. Over the following 3 weeks, while Audrey continued living in that house because leaving suddenly would have complicated the legal picture, we built a record. Audrey took screenshots of every text from Curtis about money. She made notes, dated and detailed, of every incident, every time he denied her access to funds, every time he took her transit card, every time Faye made a remark about her being unreliable or dramatic. She recorded 2 conversations on her phone, legal in our state, which is a one-party consent state, in which Curtis told her directly that her paycheck was going toward household expenses that he managed, and that she could ask him if she needed cash for something. His voice in those recordings was completely calm. That is almost the worst part. He wasn't raging or threatening. He was just explaining the rules, like she was a child who needed things explained to her, like it was perfectly reasonable. I pay for the attorney fees. I want to be clear about that. Not because I am wealthy. I am not. I am a 63-year-old retired school librarian who lives on a pension and Social Security. But because it was the most important thing I have ever spent money on, and I would do it again without hesitation. My son-in-law also made a particular mistake during this period, though he didn't know it. He decided, I believe because things had been quiet and he thought he was safe, to put the CRV, which was still titled in Audrey's name, through an emissions test and register it for another year, in Faye's name, which meant there was now a paper trail showing the car was being operated and registered by someone other than the title holder. Our attorney called that a gift. When the day came, it came quickly. The attorney filed a motion. We had documentation of the financial control. We had the recordings. We had the registration discrepancy. We had 11 months of bus pass receipts that Audrey had saved. God bless that girl. She had saved every single one. I don't know why. Maybe some part of her always knew she'd need them. We had a timeline written out in her own handwriting of every incident she could remember with dates and details. And we had me, sitting right there in the room, ready. Curtis brought his own attorney. That attorney, I will say, looked at our documentation and had a very particular expression. The expression of someone who has realized their client has not been entirely honest with them about the situation. Audrey's attorney made one thing very clear from the start. We were not looking for drawn-out litigation. We were looking for a clean resolution. Curtis would return the CRV to Audrey, retitled and with a full tank of gas. He would provide a certified accounting of her earnings over the past 3 years and an agreed-upon restitution amount for the funds she could not access. Audrey would receive an emergency protective order ensuring Bea's primary residence was with her during the separation proceedings. Curtis and Faye would cease any contact with Audrey's employer, her bank, or any of her personal accounts. And the separation agreement, when finalized, would reflect that Audrey was leaving with what was hers. He pushed back. Of course he did. His attorney suggested that the recordings might be challenged, that Audrey's mental health history was relevant, that the financial arrangements had been mutually agreed upon. Our attorney nodded politely at each point and then placed the registration paperwork for the CRV filed 3 weeks prior in Faye's name on the table. "We can continue," she said, "but I want to make sure your client understands that misappropriating a vehicle titled to another person creates a very specific category of legal exposure. Would he like to consult privately before we go further?" They consulted privately for 18 minutes. When they came back, Curtis's attorney had a slightly different posture. They were willing to discuss terms. Audrey cried in the parking lot afterward. I held on to her for a long time. She kept saying she was sorry for not telling me sooner, for letting it go on so long, for thinking she had to handle it alone. I told her the same thing I tell her every time she apologizes for something that was not her fault. You found your way to the door. That's the part that matters. Finding the door. She moved back into my house that weekend with Bea and 2 suitcases and the box of Bea's toys she'd packed while Curtis was running an errand. I had made up the guest room with the yellow quilt my mother made, the one Audrey always loved, and I had put a small lamp on the nightstand that gave off a warm light, and I had put a little stuffed rabbit on Bea's pillow because I know my granddaughter. I know what she likes. Bea ran into that room and flung herself face first onto the bed like she owned it. "Grandma," she said, her voice muffled by the quilt, "your house smells like cookies." I had baked snickerdoodles that morning. I do not think that was a coincidence. Curtis did not make the transition easy, and I did not expect him to. There were text messages. I told Audrey to forward them all to the attorney and not to respond. There were 2 instances of him driving slowly past my house, which we documented. There was a period of about 2 weeks where Faye called Audrey's cell phone repeatedly until we got a number change. The attorney handled each thing as it came. That's what she was there for. The restitution amount, when it was finalized, was not nothing. 2 years and 8 months of wages going into an account Audrey could not access, minus what the attorney and Curtis negotiated as household contribution. It wasn't everything she was owed, and it never will be. And I made peace with that because the attorney was right. Getting them out was the mission, and the mission was accomplished. The CRV came back to Audrey on a Wednesday morning. Curtis's attorney arranged for it to be dropped at my address. I watched from the kitchen window when it pulled up. The man who drove it left the keys under the mat and left without knocking, which was smart of him. Audrey was at work. When she got home that evening and saw her car in the driveway, she stood next to it for a full minute without saying anything, just had her hand on the hood. I let her have that moment. Bea has been with us for 2 months now. She is, at 4 years old, one of the most resilient people I have ever met. She asks for her daddy sometimes in the simple, uncomplicated way that 4-year-olds ask for things they are used to having. We are navigating that carefully and with the attorney's guidance. Audrey is in counseling, a very good therapist she found herself and pays for herself with her own paycheck, which now goes into her own account and always will. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband. I have raised a daughter, mostly on love and patience and a certain stubbornness that I come by honestly. I have learned, across the span of my life, that the moments when someone needs you most are often the moments when they are trying the hardest not to need you at all. My daughter was counting coins in a laundromat chair, wearing a coat with a missing button, and she was trying so hard to look like she was fine. I'm so glad I slowed down. I'm so glad I stopped. I am so glad that after all the second guessing and the telling myself to mind my own business, something in me, call it instinct, call it love, call it 63 years of knowing my daughter's voice, something in me knew that fine was not the same as okay, and that okay was not the same as safe, and that my job, the job I took on the day she was born and will keep until my last day on this earth, was to know the difference. She's okay now. Not all the way, but okay. And some mornings she brings me coffee before I'm even out of bed. And she sits on the edge of my bed the way she did when she was small. And Bea comes in and flings herself between us. And for a few minutes before the day starts, we're just 3 generations of women in a yellow quilt room. And it is enough. It is more than enough. I keep thinking about that gray coat with the missing button. Audrey had worn it for years. I'd offered a dozen times to sew that button back on, and she always said she'd bring it by. She never did. And I never pushed. I told myself I was respecting her space, her independence, her adult life. Looking back, I think part of me just didn't want to see what might be underneath the surface of things if I looked too closely. That's the part that stays with me now. Not what Curtis did, though what he did was real and it was wrong and it had consequences. What stays with me is how long I almost didn't stop. How close I came to driving right past that laundromat window, tired from the dentist, thinking about tea, telling myself my daughter was fine because she had never said otherwise. She had learned not to say otherwise. That's what I had to reckon with. When someone controls your money, your car, your movement, and then holds your child over your head like a threat, what they are really doing is controlling your voice. Audrey stopped telling me things not because she stopped trusting me, but because she had been slowly, quietly taught that speaking up came with a cost she couldn't afford to pay. That is not weakness. I want to be clear about that. What Audrey survived for 3 years took more endurance than most people will ever be asked to show. Staying calm. Saving bus receipts. She didn't even fully know why she was saving. Learning which conversations to delete before she got home. That is not a woman without strength. That is a woman who had her strength turned against her, and who kept a small, careful flame going anyway. And that flame, that's what I walked toward when I knocked on that glass. What I learned at 63 years old is that doing right by the people you love is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like sitting very still in a plastic laundromat chair and listening without flinching. Sometimes it looks like calling a friend at 7 in the evening and writing down 2 names. Sometimes it looks like baking snickerdoodles the morning before your daughter comes home. Because you know your granddaughter, and you know what she needs to feel safe, and you know that safety starts small. Curtis believed that if he was calm and methodical enough, if he kept everything quiet enough, there would be no consequences. He was wrong, not because the universe arranged some cosmic punishment, but because the choices he made over 3 years created a paper trail, a pattern, a record. Actions compound. His compounded against him. Audrey's small daily acts of survival compounded for her. I think about that when people ask me what I would tell a mother who suspects something is wrong but isn't sure. I would tell her, your instincts are data. I would tell her, the right thing and the easy thing are almost never the same thing. And I would tell her what my own mother told me once, a long time ago, that the people who love us well are not the ones who look away to spare themselves the discomfort of seeing clearly. Look clearly, stop the car, knock on the glass. Whatever comes next, you can figure out together. That's what together means.